He saw no signs of occupancy, and walked around the house to the rear. Here he saw a largish pool, covering an area about 8 by 8 feet and several inches deep in the center. But he saw more than that. He saw that this pool was covered with a thin film of what looked like blood. He did not enter the house at all. He rushed back into town and got the police, and together they broke down the door. If they had expected to find any sign of crime, they were mistaken. The house was bare, clean and without signs of occupancy, but a damp spot on the bathroom wall over the tub looked as though it had been washed recently. This wall was papered, and the washing had loosened the paper, which was still moist. "How long ago, Dean?" asked the inspector. 6 hours, maybe. It's hard to tell. The first search revealed nothing else. The cellar floor had not been disturbed, nor could they find any indication outside that anything had been buried on the property. A second and more thorough examination, however, revealed something of vital importance. In the cellar, piled behind a stack of cut wood, they found the drawers of a new wardrobe trunk of good quality, and not one of them doubted their significance. Whether all this related to the disappearance of Lydia Talbot or not, they were on the heels of a crime, and none of them but felt confident that a body had taken the place of those drawers in a trunk. Here they found unexpected corroboration. A dairyman in the vicinity, driving with his cans to the station early that morning, had seen a trunk being taken out of the house by the Hollytree expressman, whom he knew well by sight. "And right there," said the inspector later, "we ran into the worst luck of all that unlucky business, for this fellow who does the local hauling had piled his whole family in his truck and gone for a weekend camping trip." And he never showed up until late Monday night. In spite of the hot trail, however, inquiry for the trunk brought no results that day. It had not been shipped from Hollytree or any station nearby, and at last they fell back on the city itself. Here they faced the usual baggage room congestion of the summer months, and they were in the position of men certain that a terrible crime had been committed and without a single clue as to where to find the body. The frantic search included one for the camping party, but without result, and it was not until noon of a hot Monday that a trunk, waiting to be called for on the blistering platform of a way station 100 miles from the city, began to excite the interest and apprehension of the agent. He sent for the police, and the trunk was opened, about 6 o'clock that night. It contained the body of a middle-aged woman, all but the head, and was at once identified by the clothing and so on as that of Lydia Talbot. The head had been removed to allow the body to be placed in the trunk, and the entire body had been wrapped in an old piece of carpet from the house at Hollytree. I have gone as little as possible into detail. The trunk, as I have said earlier, had been disguised by a number of foreign labels, but was readily recognized as the one Miss Emily had bought and sent to the house on Liberty Avenue. There was no sign of the gold and currency it had once held, however, and an almost microscopic examination of the premises near Hollytree revealed no trace of it there. This was the situation then on that Monday evening, the 11th day after our first murder. Mrs. Talbot had collapsed, no sign had been found of Lizzie, although a nationwide search had been instituted and a general alarm had gone out at once. George Talbot had been violently sick after viewing the body, and Laura Dalton had crept on Monday night to her husband's room, knocked at the door and been heard crying hysterically after he had admitted her. The general demoralization on the Crescent was utter and complete. One by one our old servants began to give notice, the Daltons, Joseph being the first, and on Tuesday morning our colored laundresses one by one put down their irons, walked upstairs and handed in their resignations. Helen Wellington came in on Monday to say that John, her new butler, had vanished without pay, and that the remainder were packing their trunks. "I've told them how absurd they are," she said, "but it's no use. Lizzie's done her dirty work and she's got the money. Why on earth should she come back? Jim says she is crazy, but I wish I could be crazy for the best part of $100,000. A dozen Lizzies had been found by Monday night, and every hour new ones were turning up. She was a common enough type of middle-aged spinster, and the numbers of spinsters of that age who had dyed their hair black was an embarrassment to the police. Such information as we had in our house during those 2 wild days was practically entirely from the newspapers. I did not hear it all from Herbert. But the new tragedy had at least brought Mother out of her retirement, and renewed our relationship on a cool but talkative basis. She was entirely convinced that the killer all along had been Lizzie. She never liked Hester Talbot, she said, but she was fond of Lydia and John. She never got over the fact that when Mrs. Lancaster's first husband died she kept all the money. He left a will leaving part of his property to them, but after he died she produced a new one cutting them off. Lizzie Cromwell always said she'd forged it. Of course that wasn't true, but I think they all believed it. Then when John got into trouble and shot this woman he'd run off with, Hester Talbot wouldn't pay a good lawyer for him, and neither would the Lancasters. It was just by luck that he was found insane, although he really wasn't, and sent somewhere. But there was no scandal here. He had assumed another name, and he was tried and convicted under it. It was a great trouble to all of us, and although Lydia got over it all, I don't think Lizzie ever did. I always thought she was a little in love with John herself. But she added something which I now believe to be the truth. I have wondered lately about poor Emily and that money she took, Louisa. She never cared anything about money, and sometimes I think, do you suppose she had met John Talbot somewhere, he'd escaped years ago, you know, and that she took it for him? It was all so unlike her, somehow. And she was always fond of him. Curious, all that, when I remember that it must have been almost at that time on Monday night that an elderly man, with thick spectacles and one side of his face drooping from an old paralysis, walked into the 17th Precinct station house and collapsed onto a bench. Chapter 45